In the last part of the series, the echo of Joshua chapters 6 through 11 in Revelation 16 was covered. In this part of the series, the parallel continues with Joshua chapters 12 through 14 being echoed by Revelation chapters 17 through 20. In Joshua 12, it is a retelling of the kings killed by Moses and Joshua in the wilderness years and the conquest of Canaan. Similar to the retelling of the journey of Israel in the wilderness in Numbers 33, through the locations at which they camped, the fullness of details are not provided, but when reading or hearing Numbers 33, the expectation is that events specific to a location should be remembered as well. There is meaning to be retained. The same is true when looking at Joshua 12. This is done in part with the kings that were defeated by Moses, but is not done with regard to the kings Joshua defeated. However, the expectation is that when hearing the kings defeated by Joshua, the details of Joshua chapters 6 through 11 are expected to be recalled. In Joshua 13, Yahuwah tells Joshua the land that is left to be conquered, referring to the land that was promised to them in the law. This chapter also discusses the inheritance on the east side of Jordan that was given by Moses on the condition that those tribes helped in the conquest of Canaan. And with the main portion of the campaign at a close, their inheritance is restated as part of a retelling of the boundaries of it and other details that were mentioned in the law. The land east of the Jordan is prophetically referred to as heaven or sky, since the Jordan River represents the boundary between heaven and earth, or point of descent, as the name Jordan means. In Joshua 14, the inheritance of the land as it relates to the land of Canaan is mentioned again, referencing Moses' commands concerning it that are in the law, and the land was allotted to the tribes as prescribed in the law. In this chapter, Caleb also requests his inheritance that was granted to him due to his faithfulness recorded in the law. The land of Canaan that then becomes known as the land of Israel is prophetically referred to as earth, similar to the land coming out of the waters on day 3 of creation and had its name changed to earth. As part of Caleb's request for his inheritance, it is mentioned in Joshua 14 verses 13 through 15 that Joshua blessed him and gave him Hebron, which means associated, or together, and the inheritance remained Caleb's. However, Caleb had to drive out the Anakim, the very same Anakim that other spies, apart from Joshua and Caleb, spread fear about among the camp and resulted in the disobedience that led to the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Caleb confirms this in verse 12. He wants to pick up where he left off in Numbers chapter 13, and go after the inheritance that was promised and do it right. Verse 15 then states that prior to being called Hebron, it was called Kiriath Arba. Kiriath means city, and Arba is the name of the greatest among the Anakim. However, it should also be noted that Arba in the Hebrew also means 4, as in the numerical value. This becomes relevant later toward the end of this part of the series when looking at Revelation chapter 20, verses 13 through 15, which mentions that death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and that death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. Death and Hades as personified nouns in this portion of the text is a reference back to their mention earlier in Revelation, specifically the 4th seal, where they are clearly personified. This brings the connection between Joshua 14 verses 13 through 15 and Revelation 20 verses 13 through 15 together, because death and Hades are together, associated, as the word Hebron means, but is referring to the same place that is also called the city of 4, or fourth. Meaning that Arba the Anakim is the reference of death in this context, and Hades is a reference to the Anakim, because they go into the lake of fire. This is in contrast to the 4th seal, which is contextually referring to the Passover. All 7 seals do, as discussed in that part of the series previously, and death is a reference to the Messiah, and Hades a reference to those who follow him. That mention of death and Hades in the 4th seal is a follow-up from their mention in Revelation 1, where the language is not as clearly personifying death and Hades, but is more addressing having power over death and Hades as discussed earlier in the series. This mention of death and Hades in Revelation 1 could also be seen as a reference to the Anakim, given the parallel as discussed so far in which Yahuwah says he will drive them out before the Israelites if they would have only obeyed in Numbers chapters 13 through 14, instead of disobeying, which led to the 40 years in the wilderness total. And in context, Numbers chapters 13 through 14 is referring to the Anakim, who are Nephilim. To summarize this introduction, Joshua chapters 12 through 14 is a retelling of events. This is similar to what has occurred earlier in the series, prior to the book of Joshua's entrance into the parallel, where there is a retelling of events in the law as it relates to what has occurred earlier in the law, or because of the nature of one book of the law specifically, Deuteronomy, which means repeated law, and that is then reflected in Revelation as well. After the events of Revelation 16, there is a perspective change noted in Revelation 17 verses 1 through 3, where John is carried away in the spirit to be shown the judgment of the great prostitute seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have been adulterous with. In verses 3 through 6, John describes what he sees. A woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her adultery. And on her forehead was the name Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations, and she was drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Yahushua the Messiah. When looking at this description of a woman on the beast, there is a core comparison that should immediately be noticed and looked at regarding the description of the beast throughout Revelation. In Revelation 12, it mentions a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on the heads. Given the parallel to the Exodus, this great red dragon is a reference to Egypt. In Revelation 13, it mentions a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, and 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. The beast is an amalgamation of the nations. Given the parallel to the Exodus and wilderness years, this is a reference to those nations and people that Israel overcame during the wilderness years, as covered in part of the series that goes over Revelation 13. In Revelation 17, it mentions a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, not just the heads as in Revelation 13, with 7 heads and 10 horns, no diadems on the heads or horns of the beast. The woman is arrayed in purple, scarlet, gold, jewels, pearls, and has a golden cup full of abominations. On the woman's head is written, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. The woman is the same woman from Revelation 12 that represents Israel. The question then becomes, who does Israel refer to in the context of the prophecy of the book of Revelation? Israel, as a group of people, has always referred to the collective body of those who walk in the faith with Yahuwah, the God of Israel, out of bondage, out of being a slave to the flesh and things of the world, at some point in time. This is explicitly mentioned in Exodus 12 verse 38, when it says, a mixed multitude also went up with them, where them is referring to the people of Israel, mentioned in verse 37. With a numerical value of about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. And given that the slavery in Egypt began between the death of Joseph and the birth of Moses, 64 years, and the Exodus occurs when Moses was 80 years old, for a maximum of 144 years possible, with 112 years, plus or minus a little time on either side, being the more probable amount of time that the oppression occurred, the flesh and blood descendants of Abraham, starting with the 75 people that arrived in Egypt at one point after Joseph brings the family there, when he becomes appointed by Pharaoh, could not have reproduced so much as to reach the number described in 4 generations' time, from Levi to Moses, as mentioned in verse 37. This means that the mixed multitude is mentioned as an important detail to include them in the numerical value of Israel. This is further substantiated by the use of the Hebrew word Arab. As mentioned earlier in the series, the word translated as mixed is also the word Arab, meaning wolf as in the wolf of linen, which are the threads in a linen fabric, part of the fundamental structure that makes cloth. They are the horizontal threads that are woven over and under the warp, creating the fabric structure. The warp is the lengthwise stationary threads held on the loom. Therefore, this mixed multitude is part of the fabric of Israel, who is meant to be a kingdom of priests. Furthermore, it is worth noting that the Hebrew word al-rab, the root of Arab, also means to braid, intermix, give to be security as a kind of exchange, give pledge, become or be put in surety. In other words, the mixed multitude pledged themselves to Yahuwah by following Moses, who is a foreshadow of the Messiah, the body of the Messiah, the body of Israel. Yet the mixed multitude became part of Israel by default when leaving Egypt, integrated into the tribes and clans, counted in the census, and remained integrated in Israel, never once being mentioned as camping separate from the flesh and blood descendants of Abraham and Jacob at Mount Sinai, or in any other part of the journey after leaving Egypt. And looking at Revelation chapters 12, 13, and 17, as it relates to the description of the dragon, beast, and woman, there is an intentional guiding of the reader or hearer to notice that the dragon has become the woman described in Revelation 17. Given the parallel at this point with the book of Joshua, the description of the woman in Revelation 17 should call to mind Rahab the prostitute, who was saved from the destruction of Jericho in Joshua chapters 2 and 6. In a sense, she was redeemed because of her faithfulness regarding the 2 spies who echo the 2 angels in Genesis 18, and are echoed in the 2 witnesses mentioned in Revelation 11, that are spirit and truth as mentioned in John 4 verses 23 to 24. This connection to Rahab is important to understanding the woman mentioned throughout Revelation, but specifically as it relates to Revelation 17. In Revelation 17 verse 1, it says, "The great prostitute is seated on many waters." Rahab is equated with the dragon and Egypt, Isaiah 30 verse 7, Ezekiel 29 verse 3, and Isaiah 51 verse 9. In Isaiah 30 verse 7 it says, "Egypt's help is worthless and empty, therefore I have called her Rahab who sits still." The dragon has now become the woman. Rahab and the scarlet beast are distinct from each other, while still being connected as seen in the devouring of the great prostitute at the end of Revelation 17. In Revelation 17 verse 3 it says, "In the wilderness a woman was sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns, no crowns on the heads or horns." In Job 25 verse 6 it says, "How much less man who is a maggot, and the son of man who is a worm." Psalm 22 verse 6 says, "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people." In Isaiah 1 verse 18 it says, "Come now, let us reason together, says Yahuwah. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they shall become like wool." In Isaiah 41 verse 14 it says, "Fear not, you worm Jacob, you men of Israel." The crimson worm is the reference. When the female worm is ready to lay her eggs, occurring only once in her life, she climbs upon wood and attaches herself to it. A hard crimson shell forms, and is secured so that the removal of the worm would tear apart the body, killing the worm. Eggs are laid under her body. The larvae hatch and feed on the living body of the mother worm for 3 days. After 3 days, the mother worm dies, and her body excretes a crimson or scarlet dye that stains the wood and her baby worms. The baby worms remain crimson colored for their entire life. On the 4th day, the tail of the mother worm pulls up, forming a heart-shaped body that is no longer crimson, but has turned into a snow-white wax that resembles a patch of wool on the wood. The snow-white patch will then flake off and drop to the ground like snow. In Revelation 17 verse 8 it says, "The beast that you saw was, and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit, the abyss, and go to destruction." The use of the phrase was and is not and is about to rise is a contrast to the phrase who was, who is, and who is to come, which is condensed into the name of God that he gives, Yahuwah, the living one. This indicates that understanding the beast in the context of the larger timeline that is in the scope of Revelation, including the time at which it is written, is with respect to the totality of time. However, it can also be seen as echoing what occurred in the law through the book of Joshua and into Judges chapters 4 and 5. As it relates to echoing the law, the book of Joshua, and into Judges chapters 4 and 5, the beast that was, is not, and is about to rise and go to destruction is referring to those who rule over other kingdoms that then seek to oppress Israel. This is reference to Egypt and Jabin, king of Hazor, in Joshua 11. In Revelation 17 verses 9 and 10, it says, "This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he does, he must remain only a little while." Prophetically, mountains refer to kingdoms. These are 7 kingdoms that have ruled, are ruling, and will rule over the earth, specifically as it relates to the control over or possession of the land of Israel during their rule. These 7 kingdoms are separate kingdoms, ruling at separate times, having dominion over the earth, in contrast to a kingdom that is united, the beast as a whole, a one-world governance of sorts. As mentioned in the verse prior, the totality of time is to be taken into account. This means going back further than Egypt and the time of the Exodus to the first kingdom on earth mentioned, which was Babylon, or Babel, under Nimrod, in Genesis 10 verses 8 to 12. That led to the Tower of Babylon in Genesis 11 verses 1 to 9. This kingdom of Babylon that built the Tower of Babylon was a one-world governance as stated in Genesis 11 verses 1 through 4. That was brought down by Yahuwah by sending confusion in the form of multiple languages, or tongues, upon the people. The word for Babel in Genesis 10 verse 10 and Genesis 11 verse 9 is the same word that is translated as Babylon throughout the rest of the Old Testament. As it relates to the timeline at large, this means that the beast that was, is not, and is about to rise is a reference to Nimrod's Babylon. Therefore, the heads of the beast are kingdoms after Nimrod's Babylon. This is confirmed by the name on the head of the woman, which is Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. To be the mother, she must have preceded all the other nations. This points towards Nimrod's Babylon, since no nations are mentioned pre-flood. This then means that the 5 of whom have fallen, referring to the 5 heads of the beast that is not, are referring to Egypt, Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, also called the Neo-Babylonian Empire or Chaldean Empire, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks, including the 4 kingdoms that came out of Alexander's empire. This then means that the 1 is, referring to the head that is at the time of John, refers to Rome. This is relevant to the prophecies in Daniel 2, 7, and 8. In Daniel 2, the 4 kingdoms are Babylon, as stated in verse 38, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks. The iron mixed with clay is not a 5th kingdom. It is spoken of by Daniel in conjunction with the 4th kingdom that is detailed more in Daniel 11. In Daniel 7, this vision occurs at a time after the events of Daniel 2, and gives more insight into these kingdoms. The lion is Babylon, the bear with 3 ribs is the confederacy of the Medes and Persians, with the 3 ribs referring to the 3 main campaigns of this empire, the conquest of Lydia, the conquest of Babylon, and the conquest of Egypt. The leopard with 4 heads is the Greek empire that was split into 4 after Alexander's death. The 4th terrifying beast is Rome. As it relates to echoing the law, the book of Joshua, and into Judges 4 and 5, the 5 whom have fallen refers to the 5 heads of the first beast of Revelation 13 that have been defeated by Israel at the time the 2 kings mentioned in Joshua 12 are defeated by Moses, including those 2 kings, as mentioned in detail in a previous part of this series. The 5 being the Amalekites in Exodus 17, the Canaanite king of Arad in Numbers 21, Hamosh of Moab in Numbers 21 and 25, also called Baal-Peor, Sihon, king of the Amorites in Numbers 21, and Og of Bashan in Numbers 21, an Amorite and last of the Rephaim. The 1 is refers to Balak, king of Moab, who hires Balaam to curse Israel, but the curse is turned into a blessing. The 1 yet to come refers to Midian, which does not last long because vengeance is taken upon it. After Midian, the next to rise against Israel is Jabin, king of Hazor, in Joshua 11. The other kings in Joshua 6 through 10, the king of Jericho, the king of Ai, and the king of Jerusalem, do not rise against Israel, but are attacked by Israel. In Joshua 11, Jabin raises a great army against Israel. In Revelation 17 verse 11 it says, "The beast that was and is not, it is an eighth, but it belongs to the seventh, and it goes to destruction." As it relates to the timeline at large in Revelation 17, the eighth is Babylon, as mentioned prior, indicated by the name on the forehead of the woman, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. However, it is not a kingdom like Nimrod's Babylon, nor the Neo-Babylonian era. It is a reference to Israel, who has become Babylon. As it relates to echoing the law, the book of Joshua, and into Judges 4 and 5, the eighth is Jabin, king of Azor, in Joshua 11. Jabin's relationship to the seven mentioned prior is that he is a Canaanite king, just as the Canaanite king of Arad is among the seven heads listed prior. The Canaanites were the primary focus of those Yahuwah was going to war with because they were in his land, and he was going to drive them out. The Amalekites inserted themselves where they did not need to, and Yahuwah was not against them until they attacked Israel after Israel came out of Egypt. Jabin's connection to the dragon, Egypt, will be explained more fully momentarily. In Revelation 17 verse 12 it says, "The 10 horns are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour, together with the beast." As it relates to the timeline at large in Revelation 17, this can be seen as an echo of the persecution of followers of Yahushua the Messiah by the synagogue of Satan in Rome, the harlot and beast working together, from the time of the ascension to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This persecution is, and will continue to, cycle again over time. As it relates to echoing the law, the book of Joshua, and into Judges 4 and 5, this is the army of Jabin, king of Azor, in Joshua 11, that joins their forces as one to fight against Israel, in Joshua 11 verse 5, with 10 kings in addition to Jabin, totaling 11 kings, as mentioned in Joshua 12 verses 19 through 24. In Revelation 17 verses 16 through 18, it says, "The 10 horns, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked, and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind, and handing over their royal power to the beast, until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth." As it relates to the timeline at large in Revelation 17, this can be seen as an echo of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This, too, will cycle again. As it relates to echoing the law, the book of Joshua, and into Judges 4 and 5, the echo is done in contrast to the obedience of Joshua and the Israelites that conquered with him, as a warning to Israel based on the reality of what occurred in the historical books, where the redeemed did what the Canaanites before them did, and were driven out of the land. Joshua 11 verse 20 says, "For it was Yahuwah's doing to strengthen their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction, and should receive no mercy, but be destroyed, just as Yahuwah commanded Moses." This also occurs with Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, in Judges 4 verse 7, after the people have been handed over by Yahuwah to Jabin in Judges 4 verse 1, where God draws out the army of Jabin after the people of Israel cried out for help to Yahuwah. At this point, it should be clear that the woman is Israel. In Ezekiel 16 verses 35 through 42 it says, "Therefore, O prostitute, hear the word of Yahuwah. Thus says Adonai Yahuwah, because your lust was poured out and your nakedness uncovered in your whorings with your lovers, and with all your abominable idols, and because of the blood of your children that you gave to them, therefore, behold, I will gather all your lovers with whom you took pleasure, all those you loved and all those you hated. I will gather them against you from every side, and will uncover your nakedness to them, that they may see all your nakedness, and I will judge you as women who commit adultery and shed blood are judged, and bring upon you the blood of wrath and jealousy. And I will give you into their hands, and they shall throw down your vaulted chamber and break your lofty places. They shall strip you of your clothes, and take your beautiful jewels, and leave you naked and bare. They shall bring up a crowd against you, and they shall stone you and cut you to pieces with their swords. And they shall burn your houses and execute judgments upon you in the sight of many women. I will make you stop playing the whore, and you shall also give payment no more. So will I satisfy my wrath on you, and my jealousy shall depart from you. I will be calm, and will no more be angry." This unified harlot and beast is the visual of Daniel 9 verse 27, where it says in the Masoretic text, "And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator." But in the Brenton Septuagint, it is translated from the Greek as, "And on the temple shall be the abomination of desolations, and at the end of the time, an end shall be put to the desolation." This is echoed in Revelation 20 verses 7 through 10, with Satan gathering Gog and Magog, the sand of the sea, and being destroyed by fire that comes from God out of heaven. The correlation between Rahab and Egypt that the prophets reference is also found in the events recorded in Judges 19, specifically verses 27 through 30, where the concubines divided up limb by limb into 12 pieces, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and is sent throughout all Israel. All who saw it compared to when Israel came up out of the land of Egypt, which further supports the understanding that the woman in Revelation is Israel. In Revelation 18, the fall of Babylon occurs. Much of what is said in this chapter echoes what is found in the words of the prophets. Joel 3, Ezekiel 16, Jeremiah 44 and 51, and Isaiah 34 and 35. Revelation 18 verses 1 through 2 echo Isaiah 34 verses 11 through 17, and Jeremiah 49 verse 33, and Jeremiah 51 verse 37, which is mentioned as what would happen in Deuteronomy 28 as curses for disobedience. Jeremiah 49 verse 33 says, Hazor shall become a haunt of jackals, an everlasting waste. No man shall dwell there, no man shall sojourn in her. Jeremiah 51 verse 37 says, And Babylon shall become a heap of ruins, the haunt of jackals, a horror and a hissing, without inhabitant. Revelation 18 verse 21 says, Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea. Jeremiah 51 verses 63 through 64 say, When you finish reading this book, tie a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates, and say, Thus shall Babylon sink, to rise no more, because of the disaster that I am bringing upon her, and they shall become exhausted. Matthew 18 verses 5 through 6 say, Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Revelation 19 begins with continuing the downfall of Babylon by rejoicing over the fall of Babylon. Revelation 19 verses 1 through 2 echo Joel 3 verses 19 through 21. Joel 3 verses 19 through 21 says, Egypt shall become a desolation, and Edom a desolate wilderness, where the violence done to the people of Judah, because they have shed innocent blood in their land. But Judah shall be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem to all generations. I will avenge their blood. Blood I have not avenged, for Yahuwah dwells in Zion. Revelation 19 verse 3 echoes Isaiah 34 verse 10 to 35 verse 10. In Isaiah 34 verse 10 to 35 verse 10 it says, Night and day it shall not be quenched, its smoke shall go up forever. From generation to generation it shall lie waste. None shall pass through it forever and ever. But the hawk and the porcupine shall possess it. The owl and the raven shall dwell in it. He shall stretch the line of confusion over it, and the plumb line of emptiness. Its nobles, there is no one there to call it a kingdom, and all its princes shall be nothing. Thorns shall grow over its strongholds, nettles and thistles in its fortresses. It shall be the haunt of jackals, an abode for ostriches. And wild animals shall meet with hyenas. The wild goat shall cry to its fellow. Indeed, there the night bird settles and finds for herself a resting place. There the owl nests, and lays, and hatches, and gathers her young in her shadow. Indeed there the hawks are gathered, each one with her mate. Seek and read from the book of Yahuwah. Not one of these shall be missing. None shall be without her mate. For the mouth of Yahuwah has commanded, and his spirit has gathered them. He has cast the lot for them. His hand has portioned it out to them with a line. They shall possess it forever. From generation to generation they shall dwell in it. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of Yahuwah, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who have an anxious heart, Be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, with the recompense of God. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. For waters break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. And the haunt of jackals where they lie down, the grass shall become reeds and rushes. And the highway shall be there, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it. It shall belong to those who walk on the way. Even if they are fools, they shall not go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of Yahuwah shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. With looking at how the words of Revelation chapter 17 through 19 are echoes of the words of the prophets, the question may be, how does this relate to Joshua chapters 12 through 14, and the retelling of events? It is through the lens of what is recorded in the historical books of the Old Testament, while keeping in mind the blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience recorded in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26. A core message, if not the core message of the prophets, was to bring Israel back to Yahuwah by pointing out her idolatry and need to repent, because the prophets understood that what Israel did to the Canaanites would happen to Israel if she did not cease her adulterous ways and repent and turn back to Yahuwah. And they spoke their words as the Spirit of Yahuwah led them to speak. Therefore, when looking at Joshua 12, which focuses on going over the kings that were defeated by Moses and Joshua, who are both foreshadows of the Messiah, and keeping in mind all the things just mentioned, Revelation chapters 17 through 20 is echoing this repetition of the events in Joshua 12, but with the historical perspective of how this occurred to Israel, with what are now known as the First and Second Temple eras. However, what is now called the Church, or Ecclesia in the Greek, is technically Israel by Yahuwah's definition. Therefore, there is a warning to be heeded here for the churches today. This is made clear at the beginning of Revelation, with letters addressed to the churches that are echoes of Israel. As seen, the history of Israel has been echoed to the churches in the form of prophecy, as a warning to the churches so that they do not see the same fate that the kingdom of Israel in former times did. In Revelation 17, the chapters begin with stating that the objective is to show John the judgment of the great prostitute, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. At the end of the chapter, verses 15 through 18, the tense of the judgment is future, from the time that the angel is telling John. This is most clearly stated in verse 16, where it says, "They and the beast will hate the prostitute, they will make her desolate," meaning that it has not happened yet at the time John is being told. In Revelation 18 verse 1, John makes clear that a new scene in the vision is developing. Seemingly, it is a leap forward to the future events he was just told about, and will now see. The focus is on the fall of Babylon, the Babylon mentioned in Revelation 17, and for the people of Yahuwah to come out of Babylon, and not partake in her sins, so that they do not share in her plagues. The lamentations of the kings of the earth, who were made rich by the women, are also mentioned. When looking at what is said in Revelation chapters 17 through 20, and its alignment in parallel with the law in the book of Joshua through Joshua 12, it seems to be a retelling of events that begins with the focus on the vengeance on Midian. The vengeance on Midian in Numbers 31 was done because of what is recorded in Numbers 25, where Israel was seduced by the women of Moab to commit spiritual adultery by sacrificing to the gods of Moab, and eating the sacrifice and bowing down to the gods of Moab, and a Simeonite taking a Midianite woman to his family. While not technically Babylon, the concept of what is being stated in Revelation 17 through 18 concerning Babylon, and the history recorded in Numbers 26, along with the historical books of the Old Testament themselves that can be included with regard to supporting evidence of Israel's history of adultery, the concept of the two scenarios is the same, which is why they can be considered as parallel to one another. In Revelation 19 verses 1 through 3, the vengeance on Midian is still being referenced, but is with regard to the burning of their cities and the places where they lived, and all their encampments in Numbers 31 verse 10. The location in Revelation 19 verse 1 being mentioned as heaven is an echo of the events occurring beyond the Jordan, or on the east side of the Jordan, which prophetically represents heaven in the context of the book of Joshua, and its relevance to understanding end times prophecy as mentioned multiple times up to this point. In Revelation 19 verses 4 through 5, the reference to the 24 elders, which represent the Levites, and the 4 living creatures, which represent the 4 divisions of the other tribes and groups of 3 around the tabernacle, and their actions of falling down and worshiping God who is seated on the throne, and saying, "Amen, Hallelujah," and the voice from the throne saying, "Praise our God, all you his servants, you who fear him, small and great," is an echo of key statements in Joshua 1 through 4 that lead up to the retelling of the kings defeated in Joshua 12. In Joshua 1 verse 2, Joshua is told by Yahuwah to arise and go over the Jordan, which prophetically refers to descending from heaven. In verses 16 through 18, after Joshua tells his officers to pass through the midst of the camp and prepare provisions to cross the Jordan, and he reminds the Reubenites, Gadites, and the tribe of Manasseh of their oath to Moses, the people make a pledge to Joshua that is more intense than the pledge that the generation before them gave to Moses at Mount Sinai in Exodus 24 verses 3 through 8. In Joshua 3 verse 7, Yahuwah tells Joshua that he will begin to exalt him in the sight of Israel, so that they know that, as he was with Moses, he is with Joshua. This refers to the Jordan River splitting like the Red Sea when they cross. In Joshua 4 verse 14, after the people crossed the Jordan on dry ground during the time of year that its banks overflow, it says that Yahuwah exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him just as they stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life. In Revelation 19 verses 6 through 10, the marriage supper of the Lamb is mentioned. This is another way of referring to the keeping of the Passover, since it is a supper of lamb. The use of the term marriage is relevant to the covenant understanding of a marriage that is also part of understanding the Passover from the very first Passover with regard to the Exodus. The Passover in Exodus 12 was the bridegroom coming to get his bride, take her to Mount Sinai, and enter into a marriage-like covenant with her in the context where Israel is personified as a bride, as done throughout the Old Testament. In Joshua chapter 5, after the people of Israel cross the Jordan, they are circumcised and remain in the camp until they are healed. Then, they keep the Passover in the land of Canaan for the first time, and the bread from heaven that fed them for 40 years in the wilderness stops, because then they ate of the land of Canaan. Circumcision is mentioned in the law as a requirement for being able to participate in keeping the Passover. The circumcision of the flesh is an outward expression or picture of the spiritual circumcision of the heart that Yahuwah truly desires, as mentioned in Deuteronomy. Both are pictures pointing toward the reality that one day we will put off these bodies and stand before Yahuwah as our true selves, as spiritual beings, and we will either be clothed with a new body or we will incur the judgment prescribed. All of which is centered on whether an individual keeps the Passover, which is to say, does the individual partake of the Passover lamb, Yahushua the Messiah. In Revelation 19 verse 11 to Revelation 20 verse 10, the events of Joshua chapters 6 through 11 are echoed, but through the lens of Joshua 12 still, since Joshua 12 is a retelling of the kings defeated by Moses and Joshua. This portion of Revelation also includes a reference to Judges chapters 4 through 5, which is related to Joshua chapters 6 through 11, specifically Joshua 11, since Judges chapters 4 through 5 deal with the Jabin who is king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, just like the Jabin from Joshua 11. It should be noted for clarity that these Jabins are not the same individual, since Jabin the king of Hazor in Joshua 11 is mentioned as being killed in Joshua 11 verse 10 and Joshua 12 verse 19. Looking more closely, Revelation chapter 19 verses 11 through 21 echo the events of Joshua chapters 6 through 11 in a very condensed manner, with an emphasis on the events of Joshua 11. The statement in verses 17 through 18 are echoes of Ezekiel 39 verses 17 through 20, Jeremiah 12 verse 9, and 1 Samuel 17 verses 44 through 47. There is also mention of the beast, the kings of the earth, and the false prophet. The kings of the earth are slain by the sword that comes from the mouth of the one on the white horse who is called faithful and true, synonyms for spirit and truth, which is a reference to the Messiah in the context of Revelation, and Joshua, a foreshadow of the Messiah in the context of the book of Joshua. The beast and false prophet can be identified here because of their identification in the previous part of the series as it related to the 7 bowls of wrath and the conquest of Canaan. The beast is Jobab, king of Madon. Jobab means a desert, properly a crying out, a place where wild beasts cry out. Madon means stature and is used one time outside of Joshua chapters 11 and 12, which is in 2 Samuel 21 verse 20, in reference to a man that was descended from the giants, who are beasts, though they have the appearance of a human, but are not made in the image of God as man was, because they are Nephilim. The false prophet is Shimron. Shimron means watch height, referring to guardianship and preserving, from the word that means to keep, to guard, observe, give heed, as used in Deuteronomy 6 verse 4. Balaam was a false prophet because he was a prophet of Yahuwah that then led Israel astray by advising Balak on how to cause Israel to stumble and bring curses upon themselves from Yahuwah. In Revelation 19 verse 20, it states that the beast and false prophet are captured and thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. In Joshua chapter 11, both Jobab and Shimron are struck with the sword and the chariots are burned with fire along with Hazor. In Revelation 20 verses 1 through 3 it says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. After this he must be released for a little while." The mention of a great chain is an echo from Ezekiel chapter 7, which speaks about the day of Yahuwah and his wrath, his vengeance. In verse 23 it says, "Forge a chain, for the land is full of bloody crimes and the city is full of violence." The land that is being referred to upon which a chain will be used is Israel, as mentioned in Ezekiel 7 verse 2. Keep in mind that Ezekiel chapters 7 through 9 is about the wrath of Yahuwah being poured out and judgment beginning in his sanctuary, a reference to the temple, but also his holy land, Eretz. Something to keep in mind is that man is now the temple, the sanctuary in which the Spirit of Yahuwah dwells, and collectively, those who gather in his name, the church. So what then does that mean when it comes to judgment beginning at his sanctuary? Something to think about. As mentioned in the previous part of the series, Jabin is the dragon. This means that he is also the reference to the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan. In order to properly understand the echo occurring in Revelation 20 verses 1 through 10, the events of the book of Joshua, specifically Joshua chapter 11, and the book of Judges, chapters 4 through 5, must be considered together, connected by the time in between. This is because of what can be plainly seen now, looking back, with respect to the events as they occurred, but are then condensed in prophecy that is written at a much later time, and is echoing these two events, and the time between them, as if it were a single event. This understanding that there is a connection to notice between the events of Joshua chapter 11 and Judges chapters 4 through 5, and the time in between the two events, can be noticed in the prophets who speak as the Spirit led them concerning the day of Yahuwah, the day of vengeance. Therefore, the connection to make, as it relates to the parallel between Revelation and Joshua to Judges, is that the Jabin of Joshua 11 and the Jabin of Judges 4 to 5 are being considered as one individual and prophetically referred to as the dragon, the ancient serpent, the devil and Satan. This means that, even though the Jabin of Joshua 11 is killed, it is because he is considered as one individual with the Jabin of Judges 4, who appears in his place later, that, prophetically speaking, Satan is then referred to as bound for a time. The term bound is related to the time between the death of Jabin in Joshua 11 and the appearance of Jabin in Judges 4. Then, in Revelation 20 verses 4 to 6, the book of Revelation skips over the remainder of the book of Joshua for a moment in order to continue this sequence of events as it relates to the time between Joshua chapter 11 and Judges chapter 4 that involves the Jabin in the book of Judges. This is due to the book of Revelation not echoing the disobedience of those who follow the Lamb. Meaning, it is important to keep in mind that the army of Israel under Joshua was composed of men of the flesh, but the army of the Lamb, as described in Revelation, echoing the prophets, is an army that does not exist as flesh and blood, but as those who have been changed and clothed with their immortal bodies. This is foreshadowed in Numbers 31 verses 48 to 49, after the vengeance on Midian, when it states, "Then the officers who were over the thousands of the army, the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds, came near to Moses and said to Moses, Your servants have counted the men of war who are under our command, and there is not a man missing from us." It should also be noticed that the only time any losses in the army of Israel are mentioned after the census of the new generation in Numbers 26 is in the defeat at Ayah and the sin of Achan in the book of Joshua, which are related events. Otherwise, there is no loss of men from the army of Israel throughout the conquest of Canaan. In Revelation 20 verses 4 to 6 it says, "Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Yahushua and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with the Messiah for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of the Messiah, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years." As mentioned, and clearly evidenced here at the beginning of verse 4, the book of Judges is referenced with the mention of seeing thrones, and those who are seated on them were given authority to judge. The description of those who reign with the Messiah is a reference to the generation that crossed the Jordan and participated in the conquest of Canaan, those who were not counted in the first census and numbers because they were under the age at which Yahuwah determined was the threshold for child and adult. The only exceptions are Joshua and Caleb. This is also the generation that overcame the events of Numbers 25 with the worship of the gods of Moab and then took vengeance on Midian. In Revelation 20 verses 7 through 10 it says, "And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever." The mention of 1,000 years as the time of the reign echoes the words of Moses in Psalm 90 verses 1 through 4, which says, "Adonai, you have been our dwelling, our refuge in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. You return man to dust and say, Return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night." This is echoed in 2 Peter 3 verse 8 as well. This statement by Moses is often interpreted back into the words of Yahuwah in Genesis 2 verse 17, and connected to Adam's age of death in Genesis 5. This is a layer of understanding associated with the 1,000 years. However, in the context of Revelation 20, with the time being connected to the reign of the Messiah and those with him, it is a reference to the amount of time from the year of the Exodus to the year of the destruction of the first temple, which is a total of about 967 to 968 years, which is short of the 1,000 years, and just short of the age Methuselah lived to, which was 969 years, and he died in the year of the flood. The point is this: in the ideal timeline, the perfect timeline, as Revelation is communicating at this point in the parallel, Israel would have left Egypt, went into Canaan to conquer and take the promised land as they were commanded in Numbers chapter 13, destroying Jabin and his army, and reigned peacefully until another Jabin-like figure arose and brought an army against Israel, and that army would have been destroyed as the army of both Jabins were in Joshua chapter 11 and Judges chapters 4 through 5. After the death of Joshua and entering into the time of the Judges, disobedience occurs, which gives rise to the cycle of oppression by enemies and liberation through judges from within Israel until the establishment of David's reign, which then leads to a promise to David about his house and kingdom being established forever through his offspring, referring to Yahushua the Messiah. However, in keeping with this description of a perfect timeline, the 1,000 years from the time of the Exodus would land somewhere around 553 BC. At this time, the Kittim are in the early years, relatively speaking, of their rise as a nation. Kittim is another name for the Romans. This detail is important because Kittim is the son of Yavin, son of Japheth. The brothers of Yavin relevant to this discussion are Magog, Tubal, and Meshech, who are all mentioned in Ezekiel 38 verses 2 through 3, where the whole chapter is a prophecy against Gog and a people who live in the land of Magog. In Ezekiel 38 verses 2 through 3, the Hebrew phrase Nasi Rosh is translated as Prince of Rosh or Chief Prince in some translations, rendering the word Rosh as chief instead of as a proper noun. However, Rosh is a proper noun. When looking at the time from 553 BC to around 66 to 70 AD, with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, who ruled over Jerusalem from 63 BC to its destruction, this portion of time can be seen echoed in Revelation 20 verses 7 through 10, as the short time after Satan is released from his prison, that he gathers the nations at the four corners of the earth, where earth can relate strictly to the land of Israel, which Rome surrounds during this time period, replacing the Greeks militarily speaking, but having absorbed them culturally in many ways. However, this is where the hypothetical, the perfect timeline, becomes reality, because this is exactly what Rome did by 70 AD. What is missing from the events of 70 AD is fire coming down from heaven and consuming the army of Rome, along with the devil being thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur. However, the point in extrapolating out the 1,000 years from the events of the Exodus to a time in which there was a decisive ending by Yahuwah of performing services to him in a temple made by hands of man is to show that 1,000 years is not an arbitrary number, but represents perfection and has relevance to the reality of what has been recorded for us in the historical books and prophets of the Old Testament writings. This means that because the events of 70 AD are an incomplete echo of the events it is echoing in relation to the book of Joshua and Judges, specifically the events of Joshua chapter 11 and Judges chapter 4 to 5, with the Jabin each who are collectively looked at as representing Satan with regard to being echoed in Revelation, it becomes necessary to look back at these two passages to understand why Revelation 20 verses 7 through 10 includes what it says from the last half of verse 9 and onward. In Revelation 20 verses 9 to 10, the fire that comes down from heaven and casting of the devil into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and false prophet were, is referring to Joshua 11 verses 6 to 23, where Joshua is commanded by Yahuwah to not be afraid and attack Jabin and his army the next day. They do, in a sudden manner, striking all things with the sword, and setting fire to the chariots. In Judges 4, a similar scene occurs, but to appreciate the similarity fully, the commander of Jabin's army in Judges 4 must be looked at in some detail. In Judges 4 verse 2 it says, "And Yahuwah sold them into the hand of Jabin king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim." Sisera means battle array. Harosheth means woodland, from the word that means cutting, carving, skillful working, which is from the word that means to engrave, fabricate, devise, in a bad sense. Hagoyim means of the nations. In other words, the commander of Jabin's army in Judges 4 is the battle array of trees of the nations, referring to the people, the inhabitants of the nations. This reinforces the understanding that trees refer to inhabitants, or people, when used in prophetic language, such as in Revelation. This is similar to the gathering of the army that the Jabin in Joshua chapter 11 did, where he gathered all the nations he could against Joshua. Looking at the battle itself as recorded in Judges 4, in Judges 4 verse 14 it says, "And Deborah said to Barak, Up, for this is the day in which Yahuwah has given Sisera into your hand. Does not Yahuwah go out before you?" So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. This same event in Judges 4 verse 14 is described in the Song of Deborah and Barak in Judges chapter 5. In Judges 5 verses 19 through 21, it says, "The kings came, they fought. Then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh, by the waters of Megiddo. They got no spoils of silver. From heaven the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent Kishon swept them away, the ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon. March on, my soul, with might." The meaning of the following names provides some additional insight that is relevant. Barak means lightning or lightning flash, a reference to the flashing lightning sword mentioned in Deuteronomy 32. Tabor means mound and is derived from the word for broken. With this being the mount that Barak and the army of Israel charged down from, it foreshadows the Messiah waging war with those who are considered weak and broken, but who he has made strong, evidenced by their victory over Jabin and Sisera. At this point, having understood the echoing done in Revelation 20 verses 1 through 10, the focus can return back to the spot in the book of Joshua that Revelation left from to fully convey the ideal, perfect timeline that is to be expected at its appointed time. Because in the book of Joshua, there are still many things said that are echoed in Revelation, linearly still. In Revelation 20 verses 11 through 15, the echo returns to where it left off in the book of Joshua, which is Joshua 13. In Revelation 20 verses 11 through 15, it says, "Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. From his presence earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were open. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire." In Joshua 13 verses 1 through 2, it says, "Now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and Yahuwah said to him, You are old and advanced in years, and there remains yet very much land to possess. This is the land that yet remains." And the passage goes on to list all the regions that are yet to be possessed. In verse 6, after all the regions have been listed, Yahuwah says, "I myself will drive them out from before the people of Israel. Only allot the land to Israel for an inheritance, as I have commanded you." From Joshua 13 verse 8 to 14 verse 5, both sides of the Jordan are addressed. As mentioned previously, the Jordan River prophetically represents the barrier, the divide, between heaven and earth. The land east of the Jordan is prophetically equivalent to the heavens, and the land west of the Jordan is prophetically equivalent to the earth in the book of Joshua. Therefore, when Revelation says, "From his presence earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them," going on to speak of the inhabitants, it is echoing the statement of Yahuwah in Joshua 13 verse 6, when he says that he will drive out the inhabitants from before Israel, referring to both sides of the Jordan. In Revelation, this boundary or divide between heaven and earth that is present in the book of Joshua with respect to the Jordan River is echoed through the Euphrates River, as has been previously mentioned. This does not mean the Jordan River does not have significance still in its own right in the book of Revelation. However, this will be discussed at a later part of the series. Continuing in Revelation 20 verses 12 to 15, this last portion of the chapter is echoing Joshua 14 verses 6 to 15. In this portion of Joshua 14, the people of Judah go to Joshua, and Caleb is with them. Caleb speaks to Joshua, reminding him of what Moses said concerning them at Kadesh Barnea. This is the reference to the books opened in Revelation, because Caleb is referencing the law, which is composed of multiple books at the time Revelation is written, just as in the modern day. In verse 10, Caleb says, "And now behold, Yahuwah has kept me alive, just as he said, these 45 years, since the time that Yahuwah spoke this word to Moses, while Israel walked in the wilderness, and now behold, I am this day 85 years old." Caleb then goes on to ask for the hill country that he was promised. Joshua blesses him and gives him Hebron, which was formerly called Kiriath Arba. This is the reference to the Book of Life, because Caleb is connecting him being alive to Yahuwah, which means living one, and still keeping the same faith he had 45 years prior, saying in verse 12, "It may be that Yahuwah will be with me, and I shall drive them out, just as Yahuwah said." It is also worth noting that because of Caleb's detail, the amount of time that the conquest of Canaan covered can be mathematically shown to have taken between 5 and 6 years, which is also referred to as a long time in Joshua 11 verse 18. Caleb was 39 years old in the year of the Exodus, 40 years old in the second year after the Exodus, and he went out as a spy, and the total time in the wilderness was 40 years from Exodus to the death of Moses. This would mean Caleb is 79 years old at the time of the wilderness years ending. They crossed the Jordan in the 41st year after the Exodus, and Caleb says he is 85 years old when he talks to Joshua. Therefore, the conquest of Canaan lasted a total of 5 to 6 years. As mentioned earlier, the reference to death in Hades seems to be an echo of Arba and the Anakim in a coded way, since Arba means 4, and death and Hades were the 4th seal. The context in which death and Hades are referenced in Revelation is based on the context of what Revelation is echoing. In Revelation 6 with the 4th seal, it is echoing the Passover in Numbers 9, as all seals echo a Passover reference. In Revelation 20 it is echoing Joshua 14 with respect to Arba, which means 4, and the Anakim, who are Nephilim, the same Nephilim that Caleb and Joshua were ready to fight against, but the other spies spread fear about in the camp that led to wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Therefore, we see Caleb picking up where he left off, which is right around the time of the 4th seal, just after the Passover had been kept and the camp moved out for the first time. Additional reasoning as to why death and Hades in Revelation 20 are echoing Arba and the Anakim instead of Caleb and the tribe of Judah with him is because in the source of the echo, the book of Joshua, Caleb is successful and the Anakim are destroyed as noted in Joshua 15 verses 13 through 19, just as death and Hades are destroyed in Revelation 20. As it relates to the lake of fire, this is an echo of Isaiah 34 verses 8 through 10 and Isaiah 66 verse 24, which is echoing an understanding of the geography about the land that is found in Joshua 15, and provides insight into the words of the prophets. In Joshua 15, the region that is allotted to Judah runs along the border of Edom. Caleb gives his daughter the upper springs and lower springs, in addition to the land of the Negeb that runs along the border of Edom. These springs are the streams being mentioned in Isaiah 34 verses 8 to 10, as this is the portion Caleb gave to his daughter, and in Isaiah, the word translated as Edom in verse 9 is technically wrong, because the Hebrew says her streams, but is translated as Edom in English translations by translators for explicit clarity due to the prior mention of Edom in verse 5. While this portion of the series focused on Revelation chapters 17 through 20, echoing Joshua chapters 12 through 14, the slight overlap into Joshua chapter 15 at the end of Revelation chapter 20 is okay, because this leads into what will be discussed in the next part of the series, which is Revelation chapter 21, echoing Joshua chapters 15 through 21.